Just a quick disclaimer for this video, I know I talk very quickly, so I have made captions and feel free to listen to those. Also, there are a couple of fantasy names in this in this video, and I know that my pronunciation is not quite accurate to the pronunciation guide so kindly provided to us by Mr. Paolini, and I just came here to tell you that I have no shame, my pronunciation is correct. That is all. I recently, at the time of writing the majority of the script, finished the book Murtagh by Christopher Paolini, and today I want to talk about the introduction of what is, in my opinion, the book's most intriguing character. I'm going to talk about this book with no regards for spoilers, so if you are planning on reading Murtagh and don't want to know anything, please do not watch this video. Murtagh is not the first book in its series. There are 4 books that came before it called the Inheritance Cycle, which focus mainly on the character Aragon. Full disclaimer, it has been years since I read these books. I read them all when I was around 9 to 11, which was obviously quite a few years ago. These are very complicated books, filled with intricate world building, and since I was so young when I read them, I don't really remember a lot of it, and I'm sure that some of it went over my head as well. However, when I saw that the new book had been released, I didn't have time to reread nearly 3,000 pages to refresh my memory, so I decided to just go into Murtagh with what I had. And it was fine, I understood all the references, and I knew all the context I needed to understand the story. All of that being said, there could very well be things from the other books that I am forgetting or leaving out in this video, so please don't come after me. But back to this introduction, let's set the scene. The main character of the book, Murtagh, has just been thrown into the dark dungeons beneath the palace of a powerful witch queen. Try to say that 5 times fast. He is disoriented, weak, and fear begins to set in as he realizes what has happened to him. He tries to use magic to break the bars of his cell, but it doesn't work, and he realizes that he has been given a drug that impairs his concentration, which is crucial to being able to do magic. Up until this point, he believes himself to be alone. He is startled out of his thoughts by one line: "Your weirding words will not work, human." This line immediately conveys a multitude of things about its speaker. First of all, just the context of it. Murtagh was not aware of this person's presence until he spoke, and he is startled out of his thoughts by these words. Uvek is quiet and still enough that he was undetectable until he made himself known. This could be partially attributed to Murtagh's drugged state, his tunnel vision on getting himself out, or the darkness of the dungeons, but let's not forget that Murtagh is a very perceptive character, especially when it comes to possible threats. Just the page before, he looked around at his surroundings and saw that there was a lamp at one end of the hall, meaning that it's not completely dark, and he even noted the shadows in the other cells before turning his attention back to his own thoughts. The fact that he didn't see Uvek means that Uvek chose not to be seen, and was able to conceal himself accordingly. Additionally, this shows that Uvek is a perceptive and calculating character. He observed Murtagh for several minutes before making himself known, and the thing that led him to make this decision was him seeing that Murtagh was trying to do magic. And that leads us into my next point. His words here show that he not only knows about magic, but also about the drug that is preventing Murtagh from doing it. And this begs the question, how does he know about the drug? This drug, Vorgethin, is relatively rare throughout Alagacia, as are magic users. We already know from earlier books in the series that it can be quite difficult to figure out what exactly is inducing the inability to do magic, although this could also be attributed to Aragon's inexperience and relative naivete at the time he was drugged. There are also no other prisoners in the dungeon, so there is no way that Uvek could have observed this effect on another prisoner and figured it out from there, unless there was another prisoner that was removed before Murtagh arrived, which there is no suggestion of anywhere in the book. The only way I can parse Uvek figuring out about the drug is if it's been administered to himself. And the only reason that would happen is if he has some sort of magical capability. This is supported further by the fact that there are no other prisoners in this dungeon, because at this point in the book we have already seen would-be prisoners dragged off to somewhere in the vicinity. It seems that Uvek and Murtagh have been singled out, perhaps because they are more dangerous or have better odds of escaping than the other prisoners, perhaps because both of them know magic and therefore need to be monitored and drugged. So now we know that Uvek is perceptive, able to conceal himself, and can presumably do magic. But that's not all. Let's look at the specific words Uvek uses here. He calls Murtagh's incantation weirding words. This implies that he knows about the ancient language Murtagh is speaking in, at least enough that he understands that Murtagh is attempting to do magic, and it also implies that he does not use or respect the language in some sort of capacity. This line would be much more normal if it was coming from any random civilian, but as we've just established, all evidence points to Uvek being able to do magic of his own. So far in this world, we have only been introduced to 2 types of magic. Magic using the ancient language, like Murtagh tries to do here, and wordless magic, which is incredibly rare and dangerous. So when Uvek calls Murtagh's incantation weirding words, it makes us wonder. If he doesn't respect the ancient language, what does he respect? What other types of magic has he seen or maybe done himself? And then there's the last word in this line, human. Here, Uvek immediately shows that he does not consider himself and Murtagh to be kindred, despite their shared status as prisoners. He is guarded and alert. This is also quite obviously tells us that Uvek is not human himself. However, we also know from his label of the ancient language as weirding words that he's probably not an elf, since the ancient language is their native tongue, and we can guess that he is not a dwarf either, as his grammar implies that he doesn't speak the human language as fluidly as most dwarves do. There are other races in Alagacia, most prominently werecats, but there have already been a couple of werecats in this book, and that wasn't really where I was leaning at this point. Reading this line, I pretty quickly assumed, correctly, that Uvek was an Urgle, which is kind of like a giant with horns in this world, known for being bloodthirsty and boneheaded, though anyone who's read the previous books in the inheritance cycle knows that not all Urgles live up to this stereotype. They are thought of as stupid because they don't care to know the languages of the other species. They're seen as monstrous because of their large build and ram's horns. They are feared as bloodthirsty because much of their culture centers around prowess and battle. Everything that we know so far about Uvek seems to contradict this image. He is wise enough to know about magic and about the drug that is preventing Murtagh from using it, and he speaks the human language. He is quiet and undetectable, far from monstrous, up until he makes the calculated choice to step out of the shadows, and his words, while not quite friendly, are not threatening, and if anything, he seems to be trying to help Murtagh as a fellow prisoner. And all of this from a single line of dialogue. As Paolini confirms in the next couple of lines that Uvek is indeed an Urgle, it sets up this interesting paradox that I really like about his character, and this is why I think he's so interesting. He is this wise magic user who has a lot of philosophical ideas about the world and a lot of experience with animals and nature, but at the same time he is still an Urgle, and he does live up to several of the stereotypes that surround Urgles. He is a brute, he enjoys violence, and he finds a lot of honor in defeating his foes. This part isn't scripted, by the way. I just think he's a really interesting character to talk about because a lot of the characteristics that you see in this introduction would kind of set this character up to be a pacifist, but he's not. And that's something that I find really interesting, and it's a sort of character that I would be interested in writing myself. But anyways, back to the script. Uvek's introduction is masterful writing. Though some of the reader's interpretation of this line of dialogue does depend on pre-existing knowledge, like what an Urgle is and how magic and Forgethen work, much of the analysis I just made could still be obtained with no knowledge going into it. Anyone who's read Christopher Paolini's books knows that he can be a bit long-winded, but a line like this reminds us that sometimes less is more. I don't know if Paolini wrote this line with the level of intention I'm projecting onto him in my mind, but to be able to pack this much information into 7 words is something I aspire to as a writer. This line tells us so much about this character, but it honestly asks more questions than it answers, and I think that that is one of the most important things in writing. You have to remember that in order to create intrigue in your characters and your settings, you have to create questions in the minds of the readers. And you also have to do this in a timely manner so that people don't get bored. So, just to recap, in 7 words of dialogue plus a bit of context, Paolini has told us 5 things about this character. He is calculating, he can conceal himself, he knows a thing or two about magic, but not the conventional kind, he is non-human and assumedly an Urgle, and as an Urgle, he defies all stereotypes. Personally, I just think that this is really neat, and I hope that you do too. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.